So we can now go back to the roof template that we created earlier and start working on the color and diffusion maps, which is going to be pretty straightforward, just kind of manipulating this with some additional textures on top to create the color. And the diffusion is almost there already, really close to it. So what I want to do is create and save a new copy of this, which is going to be a template for the color, and we can load in a texture that we want to use to color this, add more variation. And I've just brought in the wall 61 texture and scaled it to mostly fit the canvas. We don't need to worry about any seamlessness with this specific texture, so it's going to be fairly easy to work with. What I might want to do is just flatten everything in the other groups. I don't necessarily need to. And it may make it difficult to separate in between some of the different tiles to create a color variation, but really it's going to take far too long to go back into the individual layers and separate them to create the kind of in-between amounts. So instead we can just manipulate the merged overall texture. And then I'm going to overlay that, put it on top of the color map, and we can select multiply to just kind of accent overall the texture. But what I think is going to work the best is we choose a color burn and then reduce the opacity. And let's go ahead and bring it up to about 40%. We can create another copy of this and choose exclusion and go ahead, Control I to invert it and adjust some other values this way to kind of create a little more variation in the color, adjust the levels, and we can pull out different elements this way and just pull out as much as we can from that displacement. And that doesn't look too bad. So just grabbing a little bit from it, and we could start creating a mask. One of the best ways to use the tile to create a mask is going to be to use the quick selection tool, which is part of the magic wand group, and you can just select some of the tiles just randomly. If you need to deselect anything, you can hold down Alt. Holding down Alt also makes sure that it won't try to resample the area, because sometimes it will jump and the entire document will just be consumed. So while you have a few things set up or a few groups selected, you can hold down Alt and just kind of move your way through some of the areas that aren't selected, and that's going to make sure that Photoshop pays a little more attention to those areas once it tries to sample them, in turn kind of creating a negative selection for it. So after we've selected some randomness, we can right click, refine the edge, and increase the contrast, something that's going to match the map and the edges of the tile. We don't want to feather it. We can just take a look at the contract and expand, just setting it to a value that's really going to work for this. Increase the radius a little to get rid of some of those sharper jagged lines, because those are going to be much darker part of the surface. Then click OK, and now add a mask. And then we can use that as a modifier mask for any of the layers to blend colors or any sort of different textures we would bring in. Also, even creating a layer style for it. And I've just brought in the wall 21 texture and scaled it to fit. What I can do is drag that mask over onto that layer. If we want to create an overlay of another texture within that current layer, and then adjust the blending style of what we'd like to do to the layer because of it. Exclusion can be pretty cool to give a nice subtraction of the color, so it's a little more random. Some lighter tiles. There are different modes, of course, we could use something a little darker. Linear burn works pretty nice. Of course, color burn, but we would need a much more reduced value. If we use the color burn, we can select the mask, and I'm going to unlink it. Control I to invert it. And I also want to have maybe a little more variation. That red that's showing up is a little too bright. We can also just go into Image Adjustment, Replace Color, select the red, adjust the fuzziness amount, and then change the color of that. Make it a little more yellow, reduce the saturation, and let's make it some darker spots. We don't want to affect too much, so we can choose a much deeper red, adjust the fuzziness amount, so we still have a nice color variation. And I want to go back to the layer with the mask and turn the opacity up to 100 and the fill down to 18. This way we can more effectively use one of the blending or the layer styles. And just add some more variation. You could even bring this into the generation of the normal in order to make some areas dip down or go a little further in. So it's kind of neat what you can do with just some pretty simple layer styles. So I think we'll be able to use this as the color map, at least to begin with. If we need to really reduce some of those bright and dark variations, we could use the shadow and highlight filter, which kind of works as a more advanced high pass. So let's go ahead and just flatten a duplicate and duplicate the layer over to the material. We can call it color. And all we really need to worry about now is the diffusion map, which we can create basically the same way as we created the color. So back in Photoshop, we can go over to the template, and what I want to do is take those merged layers and make them more of the dominant part to generate the diffusion. So one thing we could do is turn off some of these modifiers and duplicates, and just use the material, Control A to select all, copy, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste that in underneath. Let's set this to normal. Just to take a look at it, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control L, adjust the diffuse, And we just mainly want to get underneath the tiles. And that center strip just isn't really working. May need to select diffusion from, or that strip from another layer. Copy and paste it, and then I can just move it on top of the other layer. And it looks like I might have grabbed from the wrong layer when I copied it. And now we'll just do an eraser. So we'd use the eraser tool and just move along the sides to blend that in. And then I could just first create a duplicate as a backup and then merge those together. Now what I could do is use darken and then also go back into the levels and fine-tune it a little more. I think it should be good at the moment. I do want to take the color map and go to adjustments, black and white. So now we can take these individual colors and create a much better diffusion map. Mostly we're working with the yellow and red, although I do believe some of the other colors might have an impact. Looks like at the moment they really don't. So mostly yellow and red we're working with. So we just want to pull out a good variation out of that, and then Control L for levels, and then we can adjust the impact overall compared to the rest of the texture. So this is a pretty decent variation. We can also save this out as a new template for the diffusion. Maybe add a few more layers if needed, or adjust the blending. Linear burn, I'm going to change that over to from darken because it was just creating too many tears. And we could add another one and duplicate it, maybe go to Gaussian blur, blur it out a little. So then when we go back into levels, we've got a lot more information we can work with. If we want to step it up, maybe make a harsher fall off, and then reduce the opacity amount of this layer. And just to add a little more to be diffused. So that's should work pretty well for a diffusion map. And we'll go ahead under history and duplicate from current state, flatten the image, discard. Another thing you may want to do is to hit C on the keyboard for the crop tool and just cut from upper left to lower right, just to make sure you clip everything out of bounds. I'm going to hit Control L, and we can see through the histogram that we have a good range. So now we can duplicate this layer over to the material, and call it diffuse. Save out the file, go into Cinema, and we're going to select that roof material. We can just copy over the color which I already brought in. So starting with the normal, pasting it onto color, pasting it on diffusion, and then just selecting which of the layers you'd like to use. So that if that's too intense, you can reduce the tile that's showing up for the diffusion, or you could switch to a different mode. You could turn it on to add, which sometimes will produce a slightly better look in this case. So let's go ahead and take a look. And I've already set up some additional modifications on this material. If we take a look at illumination, we can see rather large changes to the shader type. But it ends up working really well with the global illumination. So let's take a look at a render with the roof now. Really not seeing, I don't think, enough of the normal. So I may need to generate a new normal that's more intense. Because depending on the angle I'm going to be viewing this at, we do want a pretty good variance, but also some nice bumps. And I might just need to throw a bump map on top of that to intensify that a little bit more. And also use more of a gritty bump. So we can use a combination of that displacement map along with the color to generate a bump map. Or maybe even just using the diffusion. So what I want to do is go and open up the original tile that we used to generate the normal. And I can turn off that blending strip for this version. I'm going to duplicate state and flatten the image. And now we can close out that other template without saving. And let's use the diffusion. We'll just select all, copy, and paste it. And then we can generate a bump just kind of by mixing these two together. So you might want to use maybe a different type of blend. I think maybe that separation from the diffusion might be a bit too much because it's creating those lines regardless of the blending type. Looks like maybe with exclusion we can get away with it. So we'll go ahead and try that with the exclusion layer. And save that out as our bump map. Also going to flatten, Control L, and auto level. Maybe bring in some of the darker tones. So we will be clipping some of this out, but overall it should look pretty good. We could even use this as another diffusion, another type of diffusion. Duplicate the layer onto the rough material, and let's start by naming this bump. It might be a little too intense for a bump, we'll have to see. Because we have a normal, we really don't need the bump to be perfect, because we can just reduce the intensity. So going back into Cinema, selecting the material, we can just copy the diffusion layer onto the bump texture, copy and paste, and select the bump. Go to bump, and we can adjust the intensity of that. Now, an interesting thing you can do, and this won't work for every texture type, but if you reduce the strength in a negative direction, because the normal was generated from that bump or displacement map, it does kind of have an inverse effect, and sometimes can produce a result that you may want. It's also like a biased normal map in that sense. But let's just add a little bit of that bump, not much. So let's go ahead and do 26% and take a look uh, kind of away from the light so we can see the bump showing. It does look a little bit better. Mainly, I think it's just the normal that really needs to be adjusted, maybe increasing the intensity of the normal to a very high amount. Let's go ahead and just take a look at how it's going to appear with a level of 400 for the intensity. It does cause some issues with the top, so we really just need to generate a new normal, getting that strip on top to work well with the rest of the tiles, because of the way that sharp point is, can sometimes be difficult. So I'm probably just going to end up adding a polygon to level out the top and make it blend a little bit better. So let's just bring the intensity down to 150. Anytime we go over 100, it can cause problems, especially if you have a sharp point like this. So I can modify diffusion, or maybe some of the other textures or different layers in order to improve the look, but I think it's definitely a good starting point, and definitely usable for more distant building.